Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Sherlock Holmes' story. I'm here with a mystery-filled story that will take away all the fatigue of the day. Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. I read every comment. It motivates me, and it helps me make better videos for you. If you like these kinds of stories, you can subscribe. Now relax. The story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Locked Room. Mystery. On that freezing January morning, the fog covering the streets of London was so thick that it was impossible to see the opposite sidewalk on Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, watching the smoke rise from his pipe. The smoke drifted towards the window as if trying to merge with the fog outside, then receded. "Watson," Holmes said without turning around, "did you read the news about the theatre world in the papers this morning?" Dr. Watson was folding the Morning Chronicle in his armchair by the fireplace. "No. Why do you ask, Holmes? I never imagined you were interested in the theatre." "I'm not," Holmes turned, that familiar sparkle in his eyes. "But it seems someone will have to be. Right now there's a lady standing at our door. She's dressed in black mourning clothes, expensive but not flashy. She must have lost her husband, and very recently. She took off her gloves and put them back on, which shows she's nervous. She's not from Scotland Yard because she used a private car instead of a police car." As Watson rushed to the window, the doorbell rang. A few minutes later, Mrs. Hudson ushered the elegant woman in black into the room. The woman's face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. In her mid-50s, she had once been beautiful, but now her face was weighed down by grief. "Mr. Holmes," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I'm Harriet Crane, my husband Sebastian Crane. You may know him." Holmes bowed his head slightly. The most successful theatre producer in the West End. The Dance of the Shadows, Winter Roses, The Final Curtain, all his productions. Harriet Crane looked surprised. "I didn't know you were interested in theatre." "I'm not," Holmes said curtly, "but I follow society news. It's part of my profession. Please sit down, Mrs. Crane, and tell me about your husband's death." The woman collapsed into a chair without waiting for Holmes to offer her one. Her hands were clasped in her lap. "3 days ago," she began, her voice barely audible. "We found him in his study. The door was locked from the inside. Albert, our butler, had to break the door down. Sebastian was sitting at his desk as if he were asleep. But he wasn't asleep. He was dead." "What did the doctor say?" "Dr. Morton said it was a heart attack. Sebastian's heart was already weak. He'd been on medication for years. But Mr. Holmes..." The woman paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't believe him." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. "Why?" "Because Sebastian was in such good spirits that night. He was working on a new play. He was excited. He wasn't complaining about his heart. And there's something else." Harriet took a folded piece of paper out of her purse. "We found this on his desk, the last page of his diary." Holmes took the paper and unfolded it so Watson could see. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Is VW's son still alive? I must find him. I must set things right, before it's too late." "Who is VW?" asked Watson. Harriet shook her head. "I have no idea. I was married to Sebastian for years, but I've never heard that name. Not a business partner, not a friend. Nothing." Holmes examined the paper carefully. "Is this your husband's handwriting?" "Yes, definitely." "Well, apart from this VW business, did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might want to kill him?" Harriet's lips tightened. "Sebastian was a difficult man, Mr. Holmes. He made many enemies in the business world. His rivals envied him. Jonathan Pemberton, for example, had been fighting Sebastian for years. He tried to undermine him at every opportunity. Anyone else? Dorothy Mills, a young actress. Sebastian discovered her, gave her big roles. But recently there was a problem between them. I don't know what it was, but Dorothy was very angry with Sebastian. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Mrs. Crane, I need to understand something. You said your husband's bedroom door was locked from the inside. The windows. They were closed. All of them were bolted from the inside. Any other entry? No. The study is on the second floor of the house. Its only door opens onto the hallway. Watson frowned. Then how could there have been a murder, Holmes? No one could have entered or left that room. Holmes turned, a slight smile on his lips. That's precisely why it's interesting, Watson. A perfect locked room case. Mrs. Crane, I need to go to your husband's house and examine the scene. Are you available today? Harriet immediately stood up. You can come right now. A car is waiting for you. Crane Manor was a magnificent Victorian building in one of Mayfair's most prestigious corners. The 3-story grey stone house, like the other mansions around it, silently proclaimed its wealth. As Holmes and Watson got out of the car, an elderly man was waiting at the door. Albert Finch, Harriet introduced him. He's been serving our family for 30 years. Finch was a dignified man in his 60s with grey hair. There was deep sorrow in his eyes, but also a nervous expression, as if he were hiding something. Mr. Holmes, said Finch, bowing his head, I heard you were investigating my master's death. I am ready to assist you in any way. Holmes scrutinized Finch. Were you the one who broke down the door? Yes, sir. That morning my master didn't come down for breakfast. This was very unusual for him. He was at the table every morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I tried to open it with the key, but it was bolted from the inside. I had to break it down with my shoulder. What did you see when you went inside? Finch's face tightened. He was sitting at his desk, sir. His head was slightly bowed, his eyes closed. There was a half-empty glass of wine in front of him. At first I thought he was asleep, but when I touched him, he was cold. He had been dead for some time. Holmes nodded. Take us to the study. As they climbed the stairs, Holmes examined his surroundings carefully. The paintings on the walls, the wear marks on the carpet, the dust on the banisters. Everything told him something. The study was on the second floor. The door frame was still broken, unrepaired. Inside was a large, high-ceilinged room. One wall was completely covered with books, while the other had a fireplace. A large oak table stood in the middle of the room, the leather chair behind it empty. Holmes entered the room and paused for a moment. He took a deep breath, sniffing the air. Watson, do you smell that? Watson nodded. The smell of old books? No, underneath that, very faint, almost imperceptible, bitter almonds. Bitter almonds? Watson's eyes widened. Cyanide? Perhaps, or something similar. Holmes approached the table. It was still covered with papers, pens, and that famous wine glass. The glass was half full, the red liquid inside dried up, leaving a dark ring around the rim. Holmes took his magnifying glass out of his pocket and began to examine the glass. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. What did you find? There are 2 different fingerprints on this glass, Watson. One is large, square-shaped fingers, probably Crane's. But there's another one, very faint, thinner, and longer fingers. Crane didn't drink this wine alone. Someone else touched this glass. Watson approached the glass. But Finch said he found Crane alone, and the door was locked from the inside. Yes, he did. Holmes began to pace around the room. He looked at the windows, confirming they were all bolted from the inside. He leaned into the fireplace, checking the chimney. He felt the walls, searched behind the bookcase. "You're looking for a secret door, aren't you?" said Watson. "I was, but there doesn't seem to be one." Holmes stopped in front of the bookcase and began examining the shelves. His fingers ran along the spines of the books, then stopped at one spot. "Look at this, Watson." On one of the shelves there was a small gap between the books, and on the shelf just below that gap, fingerprints were visible in a thin layer of dust. Someone searched here and found something. Holmes looked at the gap. This gap isn't the size of a book. Something smaller, flatter, maybe a notebook or a diary, suggested Watson. Perhaps, or something else. Holmes thought for a moment, then turned to Finch. "Did your master have a secret drawer or safe?" Finch hesitated. This hesitation did not escape Holmes's notice. "Finch, this is a murder investigation. Anything you're hiding could help the killer escape." The old butler sighed. "Yes, sir. There is a secret compartment under the desk, but only my master had the key." Holmes immediately went to the desk and examined the underside. A few seconds later, a click was heard, and a small drawer opened. Inside were a few papers, a stack of letters, and a yellowed old notebook. Holmes took out the notebook and opened it. On the first page was a handwritten title, The Dance of the Shadows, First Draft. And in the lower corner of the page, a faint signature, V.W. Watson's eyes widened. V.W., the name in the diary. Holmes quickly flipped through the pages. "This is a play draft, Watson. The first draft of Crane's most famous work, The Dance of the Shadows. But it's not in Crane's handwriting. Someone else wrote this." "What do you mean?" Holmes lifted the notebook, held it up to the light. "This notebook is at least 15 years old. The paper is yellow, the ink faded. And this handwriting—" He paused, his brow furrowed. "I've seen this handwriting somewhere before." "Where?" Holmes didn't answer. He carefully put the notebook in his pocket and left the room. Watson and the others ran after him. "Holmes, where are you going?" "To Scotland Yard, Watson. I need to speak with Inspector Lestrade, and then to the newspaper archives." That evening, when they returned to 221B Baker Street, Holmes had a strange expression on his face. He sat down in his chair opposite the fireplace, lit his pipe, and thought silently for a while. "Watson," he said finally, "this case is much deeper than it appears. What have you found?" "Nothing yet, just questions. Who is V.W.? Why was Crane keeping that draft? And most importantly," Holmes took a deep drag on his pipe, "where is V.W.'s son?" Watson shook his head. "Are you still sure this was murder? Maybe it really was a heart attack." "No, Watson." Holmes's eyes were determined. "That bitter almond smell, that second fingerprint, and Crane's last diary entry. Someone entered that room, made Crane drink poisoned wine, and then locked the door behind them. But how? The door was bolted from the inside." Holmes smiled. "That's the real question, isn't it? And I'll find the answer. Because Watson—" He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, fog still enveloped London. There are no perfect murders, only incompetent investigators. That night, Holmes pored over that old notebook for hours. He turned the pages one by one, read every word, analysed every curve of the handwriting. And somewhere, there had to be a clue as to the identity of this mysterious VW. While London slept outside, the lights on Baker Street burned until morning. Chapter 2: Shadows of the Past. The next morning, Holmes was up at dawn. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend at the table. Spread out before him were dozens of newspaper clippings, notes, and that old notebook. Holmes's eyes were bloodshot. Clearly, he hadn't slept at all. "Have you had breakfast, at least?" asked Watson, reaching for the tray Mrs. Hudson had brought. "Food slows the mind, Watson." Holmes picked up a clipping. "But I've found something important. Sebastian Crane's first major success, The Dance of the Shadows, was staged in 1881. Critics raved about the play, and Crane became famous overnight. But here's the interesting part." Watson sat down in his chair and prepared to listen. "I searched the newspaper archives of that period. In 1880, a year before the play was staged, there's a small news item. A young playwright named Vincent Whitfield claimed that his play had been stolen, but no one took him seriously." "Vincent Whitfield," Watson said slowly. "VW. Exactly, and the story gets even darker." Holmes showed another clipping. "In 1882, Vincent Whitfield committed suicide by jumping into the Thames River. He left behind a wife and a 6-year-old son." Watson's face paled. A 6-year-old son. The note in Crane's diary. He was asking if VW's son was still alive. Yes, Crane knew he had stolen Vincent's play, and years later, just before he died, he started looking for Vincent's son. Why? Guilt? Or... Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. Or was he afraid his son would find him? Just then, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hudson announced a familiar name. Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade entered the room with his usual hurried steps. His face wore a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. "Holmes, we need to talk about the Crane case." "Sit down, Inspector. I have things to tell you." Lestrade sat down and listened to Holmes's findings. The locked room, the second fingerprint, the VW draft, and the Vincent Whitfield story. With each detail, his brow furrowed a little more. "So you're saying," Lestrade finally said, "that Sebastian Crane stole a man's play 15 years ago? The man committed suicide, and now someone has murdered Crane?" "Murdered him, perhaps. It's not certain yet, but it's a strong possibility." "So who's the killer? Vincent's son?" Holmes shook his head. "I don't know yet. I haven't even found the son's name. The mother and child disappeared after Vincent's death. There are no records." Lestrade stood up. "Scotland Yard didn't officially open this case as a murder investigation. Dr. Morton said it was a heart attack, and we accepted that. But if you're right, Holmes..." "I am right, Inspector, and I will prove it. But first, I need to talk to a few more people." That afternoon, Holmes and Watson made their first visit. Jonathan Pemberton's office was in a grand building on Drury Lane. Pemberton was 48 years old, short and stout. His grey hair was combed back, and his small eyes darted constantly as if expecting danger at any moment. "Sherlock Holmes," said Pemberton, ushering them into his office. "The famous detective. I hear you're investigating Sebastian's death. Wasn't it a heart attack?" "It appears so," said Holmes calmly. "But I have some questions." Pemberton sat down behind his desk and clasped his hands. "Ask away, but first, let me say this. I'm not sorry about Sebastian Crane's death. The man was a snake. He tried to crush me for years, sabotage my plays, stole my actors. I'm glad he's dead." Watson looked at him in astonishment. He hadn't expected such open hostility. Holmes, however, seemed completely unperturbed. "Is there a particular reason you hated him so much?" Pemberton's face darkened. "In 1885, I wrote a play. It was my best work. A week before the premiere, Crane bought my lead actor with money. The play flopped. I went bankrupt. It took me years to recover." "Did you want to kill Crane?" "Every day." Pemberton didn't look away. "But I didn't. I didn't have the courage, to be honest. I'm a coward, Mr. Holmes. I fight with words, not deeds." Holmes studied Pemberton for a moment. "Have you heard the name Vincent Whitfield?" A momentary look of surprise flashed across Pemberton's face, then vanished quickly. "No. Who is he?" "It doesn't matter." Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. Perhaps we'll meet again." When they went outside, Watson asked, "Do you believe him?" "That he hates Crane, yes. That he killed him." Holmes hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." But something happened in his eyes when he heard the name Vincent Whitfield. "He knows that name, Watson. But why is he hiding it?" Their second stop was the boarding house where Dorothy Mills was staying. The young actress greeted them in her small, modest room. She was 28 years old with auburn hair and large hazel eyes. She was beautiful, but beneath her beauty lay a weariness, a fragility. "Mr. Holmes," Dorothy said as she ushered them in, "I knew you were coming. Everyone is talking about your investigation into Crane's death. Miss Mills, can we talk about your relationship with Sebastian Crane?" Dorothy walked to the window and looked outside. "Sebastian discovered me. 3 years ago, I was working as an extra in a small theatre. He saw me, said I was talented. He gave me big roles, made me a star." She turned, her eyes moist. "But it wasn't for free." Watson was uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" "Sebastian wanted something in return for everything he gave me. Not money, other things." Dorothy's voice trembled. "First, he just wanted me to be grateful to him. Then he wanted me to obey him. Then—" Holmes interrupted. "I understand, Miss Mills. No need to go into detail. When was your last meeting with Crane?" 2 days before his death. He called me to his office. He said he wanted to give me a role in a new play, but there was a condition." Dorothy clenched her fists. "I refused. I told him I wouldn't be his puppet anymore. He got very angry, shouted, threatened me. He said he would ruin my career. And then he died." There was a strange sense of relief in Dorothy's voice. "Someone gave him what he deserved, Mr. Holmes. Whoever did it, I owe them my thanks." Holmes studied the young woman carefully. "Where were you that night, Miss Mills?" "Here, in my room. My landlady, Mrs. Patterson, can confirm that. I was here all night." "Have you heard the name Vincent Whitfield?" Dorothy frowned. "No, I haven't. Who is he?" Holmes stood up without answering. "Thank you, Miss Mills. Perhaps we'll meet again." That evening, Holmes and Watson returned to Crane Manor. This time their purpose was different. Holmes wanted to speak privately with the house's butler, Albert Finch. Finch greeted them in Sir Wolfius, the small room next to the kitchen. The old man's face was weary, his shoulders slumped. The weight of losing his master of 30 years seemed to weigh heavily on him. "Finch," Holmes said gently, "I have some questions for you, and I expect honest answers. You served your master for 30 years. You probably know most of his secrets." The old butler bowed his head. "Some of them, Mr. Holmes, but it wasn't my place to pry into my master's private life." "Have you heard the name Vincent Whitfield?" Finch's hands trembled. This reaction did not escape Holmes's notice. Finch? The old man took a deep breath. Yes, sir, I have heard that name a very long time ago. Tell me. Finch walked to the window. Darkness had fallen outside, and the trees in the garden swayed in the shadows. It was 1880. My master was not yet well known, doing small productions. One day a young man came to the house. His name was Vincent Whitfield. He had written a play and wanted my master to stage it. What happened? My master read the play and liked it very much, but he offered Vincent very little money. Vincent was in financial trouble. He had to accept. He sold the rights to the play to my master. Finch turned, guilt in his eyes. But Mr. Holmes, I saw those papers. Vincent hadn't sold the rights to the play. He had only given the staging rights. My master altered the documents. Watson said angrily. So Crane stole the play. Yes, sir. Finch bowed his head. And when Vincent realized this, he tried to fight back. But my master was powerful. He had connections. He had Vincent declared insane, destroyed his reputation. Poor man. He committed suicide, said Holmes. He jumped into the Thames. Yes, and the gentleman became rich and famous overnight. Finch's voice was venomous. He rose on the blood of another man. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he asked, what happened to Vincent's family? He had a wife and a young son. They disappeared after Vincent died. The gentleman searched for them for a while, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps for some other reason, but he couldn't find them. What about recently? Did Crane ever mention it? Finch hesitated. He did, sir. He's been very anxious these past few weeks. He was going through old files, asking questions. He was muttering something about VW. It was as if he was afraid of something. Afraid of whom? I don't know, sir, but the day before his death, he was arguing with Thomas in his study. Holmes's eyes lit up. Who is Thomas? Thomas Whitfield, sir, the master's assistant. He's been working with us for about a year. Watson and Holmes looked at each other. The surname Whitfield couldn't be a coincidence. What do you know about this Thomas? Holmes asked. He's 19, a bright young man. My master loved him dearly, treated him almost like a son. Thomas was very devoted to my master, at least. It seemed that way. Where is Thomas now? I don't know, sir. I haven't seen him since my master's death. Mrs. Crane gave him permission to visit his family for the funeral. Holmes stood up. Where is Thomas's room? Thomas's room was a small servant's room in the attic of the house. When Holmes opened the door, he found a modest but tidy space. A narrow bed, a small desk, several shelves full of books. Everything was extremely orderly. Holmes began searching the room systematically. He opened drawers, examined books, looked under the pillow. Watson waited at the door, watching his every move. Here, Holmes said suddenly. He had pulled an old trunk from under the bed. Inside the trunk were clothes, a few books, and a small wooden box. Holmes opened the box. Inside was a faded photograph and a folded letter. The photograph showed a young man, a woman, and a small child. The man's face looked familiar. Vincent Whitfield, said Holmes, showing the photograph to Watson, with his wife and son. Watson looked at the photograph. He studied the little boy's face. This child. Thomas, Vincent Whitfield's son. Holmes opened the letter and began to read. My son, Thomas, by the time you read this letter, I will no longer be in this world. There are things I must tell you, truths I must not keep from you. Sebastian Crane took everything from me, my game, my reputation, my future. But there is one thing he cannot take from you, justice. One day, when the time is right, you will learn the truth. and you will decide what to do. Just remember this: revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it. Your loving father, Vincent Whitfield. Holmes folded the letter carefully. There's our motivation, Watson. Thomas Whitfield infiltrated Crane's inner circle to avenge his father. He gained his trust over a year, learned his secrets, and then... he killed him? Holmes walked to the window. Outside, the moon appeared and disappeared behind the clouds. Perhaps. But there are still unanswered questions. How do we explain the locked room? Where did the poison come from? And most importantly, he turned a determined look on his face. Where is Thomas Whitfield? Chapter 3. The Stolen Legacy. It was well past midnight. A deep silence reigned over the streets of London. Only the occasional clatter of a horse-drawn carriage's wheels on the cobblestones could be heard. The pale moonlight filtering through the window of Baker Street illuminated the papers on Holmes's desk. This light, spreading like a silvery blanket, deepened the shadows in the room. Watson had long since gone to bed. Faint snores could be heard from his room upstairs, but Holmes could not sleep. The wheels in his mind were turning incessantly, working like a machine. Before him lay 3 objects: Vincent Whitfield's handwritten play draft, the letter found in Thomas's room, and Sebastian Crane's diary. The yellowed papers carried the weight of the past. Holmes picked up his magnifying glass and began comparing the handwriting. His eyes narrowed, his brow furrowed. Every letter, every dot was scrutinized. Vincent's handwriting was elegant, written in slanted letters. The ink flowed across the paper as if dancing. The meticulousness of an artist was evident in every word. The letters were gently connected. The lines progressed smoothly. His son Thomas's writing, on the other hand, was straighter, more decisive. The pen had pressed harder on the paper. The letters formed at sharper angles. But in some letters, especially the curves of the capital letters, his father's influence was evident. Holmes studied it for hours. As the candle flame flickered, shadows danced on the walls. Finally, something caught his attention. On the last page of the draft, right next to the VW signature, there was a small symbol. 2 interlocking circles, drawn in faint ink. This mark could easily be overlooked at first glance. Holmes had seen this symbol before, but he couldn't remember where. Somewhere deep in his memory, this symbol held meaning. With the first light of morning, Watson came downstairs. The sound of his footsteps filled the quiet house. He found Holmes in the same position, bent over his desk. Dark circles had formed under the detective's eyes. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his gaze was still sharp and alert. "Didn't you sleep at all?" "It's not time for sleep, Watson." Holmes slowly got to his feet. His back was stiff, his joints aching from being immobile for so long. He stretched and walked wearily to the window. Outside, London was waking up. The voices of street vendors and the neighing of horses were beginning to rise. Today is an important day. We need to find Thomas Whitfield. Finch said he went to visit his family. Yes, but which family? Thomas was 6 when Vincent died. He and his mother vanished. Quietly, they disappeared without a trace. Where did they live for 13 years? How did they survive? A child and a widow, penniless, without reputation, Watson thought. He put his finger to his chin, frowning. Perhaps the mother has family, relatives on the girl's side. Holmes shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fogged-up window pane. Reasonable. We need to find Vincent's wife's maiden name. That morning, while the fog had not yet completely lifted, Holmes and Watson went to the registry office. The building was a gloomy Victorian structure. Its grey stone walls had darkened with years of grime. The air inside was heavy and dusty, permeated with the smell of old paper and ink. After hours of research, their fingers blackened with ink, and after sifting through countless ledgers and record books, they discovered that Vincent Whitfield had married Catherine Murray in 1875. The Murray family came from a small town near the Scottish border. Thomas may have gone there, Watson said hopefully, his eyes brightening. Perhaps. But first we need to go somewhere else. Holmes pulled a small folded piece of paper from his pocket. An address was written on it. I found something else in the newspaper archives last night. An old friend of Vincent Whitfield's, now a retired journalist. Cornelius Wade. He might know everything that happened back then. Cornelius Wade lived in a modest house in East London. The house was at the end of a narrow street, squeezed in between other houses. The peeling paint on the door, the cracked window panes and the dried-up plants in the garden bore the marks of a neglected life. Wade was a 65-year-old man with a white beard and tired eyes. His beard was unkempt and messy, and the bags under his eyes bore the marks of years of sleepless nights. When he opened the door and saw Holmes, he was surprised. His eyebrows rose, his mouth slightly parted. "Sherlock Holmes," said Wade, his voice sounding both surprised and nervous. His hand trembled on the door handle as he let them in. "The famous detective. What brings you here?" "I want to talk about Vincent Whitfield." Wade's face paled. He recoiled as if he had seen a ghost. His hand trembled on the door handle, his fingers clenched until they turned white. Vincent. I hadn't heard from him in years, until I read about Sebastian Crane's death last week. Holmes and Watson moved into the small sitting room. The room was cramped and cluttered in every corner. The walls were covered with old newspapers and photographs, yellowed clippings, faded portraits, relics of the past. The air was heavy, dominated by the smell of tobacco and old books. Wade offered them tea. His hands still trembled as he carried the porcelain cups, spilling tea onto the saucer. "Did you know Vincent?" asked Holmes. His eyes followed Wade's every movement. "I knew him. We were close friends in our youth." Wade sighed deeply. His chest rose and fell, as if under a heavy weight. He was a talented writer, perhaps the most talented I've ever known. He used words like a painter, but he was unlucky. He trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. "You mean Sebastian Crane?" Wade shook his head slowly. The wrinkles on his face deepened. Crane was a snake. He looked bright and attractive on the outside, but he was full of venom inside. He stole Vincent's play, and he didn't stop there. When Vincent protested, Crane smeared him. He leaked false stories to the newspapers, spreading rumors that Vincent was insane. He systematically destroyed him. "Did you write those stories?" Wade's eyes filled with tears. Tears gathered in his eyelashes as the old man bowed his head. "I'm ashamed to say it, but yes. I was a young reporter back then, an ambitious man trying to climb the career ladder. I obeyed my boss's orders. Crane was friends with the owner of our newspaper. They told us what to write, and we wrote it. Without questioning, without thinking," Watson said angrily. His face was red, his fists clenched. "You ruined a man's life." "I know. Wade covered his face with his hands. Sobs rose between his fingers. I think about it every day. Every morning when I wake up. Every night when I go to bed. When Vincent killed himself, something inside me died. I've been living with this guilt ever since, this remorse eating away at me. Holmes was silent for a moment. The clock in the room ticked, the seconds passing slowly. Then he asked, "What happened to Vincent's family?" Wade raised his head. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet with tears. "Catherine and little Thomas. After Vincent died, I tried to find them, wanted to help. I knocked on their door, wrote letters. But Catherine refused to talk to me. She was right. I had a hand in her husband's death. Then I heard they had gone to Scotland, to her family. Then what happened? I don't know. I heard Catherine fell ill and died a few years later. I never found out if it was tuberculosis or something else. I never found out what happened to Thomas either." Wade paused. His eyes drifted into the distance, as if looking into the past. Until... Holmes leaned forward, his eyes sharpened, every muscle tensed. Until... Last year, something strange happened. A young man came to visit me. He knocked on this very door, sat in this very room. He didn't give his name, but he asked questions about Vincent. He wanted to know how he died, what Crane did, everything, every detail, every nuance. What was this young man like? 19 or 20 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes, thin-faced, pale-skinned. He seemed calm, his voice low and controlled, but there was anger in his eyes. Controlled, cold anger. Like a volcano, calm on the outside but boiling inside. Holmes and Watson looked at each other. Their glances were meaningful. Thomas Whitfield's description was exactly that. "What did you tell him?" "Everything. What Crane did. How Vincent was destroyed. My guilt." Wade trembled, his shoulders slumped. The young man listened, didn't say a word. His face was like a stone mask. Then he stood up and left. He turned at the door and said something. What did he say? Wade's voice dropped to a whisper. It was as if even saying the words frightened him. He said, "Justice may be delayed, but it will never fail to come." Then he left, and I never saw him again. But those words kept ringing in my ears. By the time they returned to Crane Manor, it was afternoon. The sun cast faint rays through the clouds, and the manor's Gothic silhouette stood like a dark shadow against the sky. Holmes went straight to Sebastian Crane's study. The stairs creaked beneath his feet. There must have been something he had missed before. The room was still the same. The broken door hinged open. The bookcases towered like giants leaning against the walls. The large oak table dominated the center of the room. There was still a faint smell of cigarettes and old leather in the air. Holmes slowly walked around the room. He examined every corner, every detail again. His fingers traced the furniture. His eyes scanned every shadow. He looked at the papers on the table. Notes from Crane's last play, letters, bills. He read them all one by one, held each up to the light. Then his eye caught something. In the corner of the desk, under the papers, was a small notebook. Leather-bound, worn, the corners frayed. He hadn't seen it before, or rather, he hadn't noticed it. He opened the notebook and carefully flipped through the pages. Notes, dates, names in Crane's handwriting, scrawled and hasty, as if thoughts were escaping even as they hit the paper. And on one page it said, "I have my suspicions about T.W. I need to look into his past. The Murray surname rings a bell. Catherine Murray. Vincent's wife. Holmes continued reading the page. His heart quickened. Thomas Whitfield, Vincent's son. He came to find me, but why? Revenge or something else? I must tell him, explain everything. Perhaps he will forgive. The date on the note was 3 days before Crane's death. The ink was still fresh. "Watson," said Holmes, his voice tense and sharp. Crane knew who Thomas was. He found out before he died. But why didn't he do anything? Maybe he tried. Finch said he argued with Thomas the day before he died. Maybe Crane wanted to confess, but Thomas wouldn't listen. Or maybe it was too late. Holmes put the notebook in his pocket and headed for the bookcase. He examined the shelves next to the secret drawer he had found earlier. His fingers ran over the spines of the books, checking the back of each one. "There must be other secret compartments here," he muttered. His voice was low and thoughtful. Crane was a paranoid man. One hiding place wasn't enough for him. A separate corner for every secret, a separate hole for every sin. He searched for half an hour, moving dusty books, tapping wooden panels, checking every millimeter. Finally, on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, close to the floor, he noticed something out of place. Part of the wooden panel made a different sound than the E. Others, it was emptier, more echoey. Holmes pressed down on the panel. With a small click, a secret compartment opened. Inside were old papers, documents, and yellowed envelopes. They smelled dusty and musty. "What did you find?" Watson came over, leaning in curiously. Holmes took out the documents and began to examine them. His eyes scanned the lines quickly. Evidence of Crane's dark past. Blackmail letters, threatening notes, payment records. This man was even darker than we thought. Among the documents was a list. No names, just initials and dates. W, 1880, £500 P, 1883, £300 M, 1887, £750 D, 1892, £400. "Blackmail victims," said Holmes, his voice cold and analytical. "W is probably Whitfield. Crane paid Vincent £500 for the rights to the play, but it's doubtful whether that money was actually paid. Maybe it only exists on paper." Watson looked at the list, his brow furrowed. Who could P be? Pemberton? Probably. And D might be Dorothy Mills. Crane seems to have kept everyone under his thumb. He spun his web like a spider. Holmes found another envelope among the documents. It was different from the others, older, more worn. It was marked "Do Not Open" in shaky handwriting. He carefully opened the envelope and read the letter inside. His face paled, his jaw tightened. "Watson, read this." The letter was written in Vincent Whitfield's handwriting. The ink was blurred in places, as if it had been soaked with tears. It was the last letter he had sent to Crane just before his suicide. "Sebastian, you took everything from me. My play, my reputation, my future. My family is starving. My wife is sick. My son doesn't understand what's going on. He looks at me with innocent eyes and asks why I'm crying. You, on the other hand, have become rich and famous with my work. You receive applause, praise rains down on you. You shine with my words. I can't take it anymore. Tonight I will go to the Thames and end it all. The dark waters will take me. But know this, one day someone will come to settle the score. Maybe my son, maybe someone else. Justice will prevail sooner or later. Be damned forever. Vincent Whitfield." Holmes folded the letter carefully. His hands trembled slightly. Crane kept this letter for 15 years. He must have looked at it every day and remembered his guilt. These words must have echoed in his mind. But still, he did nothing. He never apologized, never paid compensation. Until Thomas came to his door. Yes. Holmes walked to the window, slowly, thoughtfully. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky turning shades of red and orange. The shadows of the trees were lengthening, darkness slowly descending. Now I'm beginning to see the whole picture, Watson. Thomas spent years planning his revenge for his father. Patiently, carefully, coldly. He infiltrated Crane's inner circle, gained his trust, learned his secrets. And then he killed him. Holmes turned. His face remained in shadow, only his eyes gleaming. Perhaps. But there are still missing pieces. Where did the poison come from? How do we explain the locked room? And most importantly, did Thomas do this alone, or did he have an accomplice? At that moment, the door opened. The hinges creaked. Albert Finch entered, his face pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Mr. Holmes, I have news." His voice trembled. "Thomas Whitfield is back. He's downstairs right now, talking to Mrs. Crane." Chapter 4. The Son's Return. Holmes and Watson hurried down the stairs. Downstairs, in the large hall, a young man was sitting opposite Mrs. Crane. Thomas Whitfield was just as Finch had described him, 19 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but in the depths of his eyes a careful observer could detect a cold determination. Thomas stood up when he saw Holmes. There was no surprise on his face, as if he had been expecting this encounter. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Thomas, his voice even and controlled. "We finally meet. I've heard a lot about you." Holmes scrutinized the young man. His clothes were simple but clean, his shoes freshly polished. His hands were in his pockets, and he stood relaxed. But Holmes noticed that Thomas's right hand was trembling slightly. He was hiding his nervousness. "Thomas Whitfield," said Holmes, "or by your real name, Thomas Murray Whitfield, Vincent Whitfield's son." The air in the room suddenly tensed. Mrs. Crane looked at Thomas in shock. Finch froze in the doorway. Thomas just smiled slightly. "I see you've done your homework, Mr. Holmes." "Yes, Vincent Whitfield was my father, and Sebastian Crane killed him." "Did you kill Sebastian?" asked Mrs. Crane, her voice trembling. Thomas turned and looked at the woman. There was a strange look in his eyes, a mixture of pain and anger. "No, Mrs. Crane, I didn't kill him. But I wish I had. I won't deny it." Holmes stepped forward. "Then why did you work here under a false identity? Why did you gain Crane's trust?" Thomas walked to the window. He looked outside, his back to them. He was silent for a long time. Then he began to speak, his voice low and weary. "I was 6 when my father died. My mother took me to Scotland to her family. For years I didn't know how my father died. My mother didn't tell me. She was protecting me. She only said that her father was very tired and was now resting." Thomas turned around. His eyes were moist, but he wasn't crying. 5 years later, my mother fell ill. On her deathbed, she told me everything, how brilliant my father was, how wonderful his plays were, and how Sebastian Crane stole everything. Watson asked softly, "What exactly did your mother say?" "That Crane stole my father's greatest work, that he discredited him, that he destroyed our family, that my father jumped into the Thames and never came up." Thomas's voice hardened. "My mother made me promise. She wanted me to stay away from Crane, not to seek revenge. She said, 'Revenge will kill you too, son. Keep your father's memory alive, but don't waste your life on it.'" Holmes bowed his head slightly. "But you didn't keep your promise." I didn't. Thomas took a deep breath. When I turned 18, I returned to London. I had a small inheritance from my mother's family, and I was living off that. I watched Crane from a distance for months. I learned how he lived, who he saw, what he did. And then you got a job as his assistant. Yes, a year ago. I prepared fake references, invented a different past. Crane hired me, never suspected a thing. Thomas laughed bitterly. He actually liked me. Sometimes he would say, "If only I had a son, he would be like you." Every time I heard that, it burned inside me. Mrs. Crane stood up. Her face was flushed with anger. "You lied to my husband. You infiltrated our home, and now you're telling us you're innocent." "I'm not innocent, Mrs. Crane." Thomas looked into the woman's eyes. "But I'm not a murderer either. I thought about killing Crane. I even planned it. But I couldn't do it. I changed my mind at the last moment." Holmes interrupted. "Why? You planned for years. You had the perfect opportunity. Why did you change your mind?" Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he took a small piece of paper out of his pocket. "Because of this. I found my father's letter. The last letter he wrote before he died. My mother had hidden it. I found it among her belongings." Holmes took the letter. It was the same one he had found in Thomas's room earlier. "I know this letter. We found it in his room." Thomas nodded. "My father wrote something in that letter. Revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it. I thought about those words for years, and as I got to know Crane, I realized my father was right." "What do you mean?" "Crane wasn't a happy man, Mr. Holmes. Despite his wealth and fame, he was empty inside. He had nightmares every night and couldn't sleep without sleeping pills. My father's ghost wouldn't leave him alone." Thomas leaned against the window. "One night, I watched him while he was working in his office. He was looking at an old photograph of my father and crying. At that moment, I realized Crane was already paying for his sins. Killing him would have been saving him." Watson looked at him in astonishment. "So you didn't really kill Crane?" "I didn't, I swear." Thomas's voice was sincere. "The night before he died, I spoke with him. He said he wanted to confess everything. He wanted to find my father's family and apologize, to pay compensation. It was belated remorse, but at least it was something." Holmes frowned. "Finch said you two argued that night." "We argued. I didn't trust him. He had lied for years, ruined my father. Did he think a few tears would make everything okay? I got angry, I yelled. But then I calmed down and left. I stayed in my room that night. They found him dead in the morning." Holmes looked at the young man intently. What Thomas said made sense, but Holmes was still suspicious. It could be a perfect lie, or the truth. "Thomas," Holmes said finally, "I'm going to ask you a few more questions, and I expect honest answers. Where did you go last summer?" A look of surprise flashed across Thomas's face. "What?" "Finch said you took leave last summer, that you went to visit relatives. But you have no relatives outside Scotland. Where did you go?" Thomas hesitated. This question caught him off guard. I was doing research." "Where?" "In Brazil." Everyone in the room looked at Thomas in astonishment. Watson asked, "Brazil? What were you doing there?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I was gathering information about Crane. Years ago, he had a business partnership in Brazil and got involved in some shady dealings. I found out about it and went there to find proof." Holmes's eyes lit up. "What kind of proof?" Documents showing that Crane made money through illegal means. His partner in Brazil had cheated him, and Crane had threatened him. Blackmail, threats, maybe worse. I wanted to destroy Crane with this information. Did you find what you were looking for? Thomas shook his head. No. The partner was dead. The documents were gone. I wasted 3 weeks. Holmes thought for a moment. Thomas's trip to Brazil was an important detail. Curare poison was native to South America. Could Thomas have obtained the poison there? What kind of places did you visit while in Brazil? Holmes asked. Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, a few small towns. I was tracking Crane's old partner. Did you go to any forest areas? Did you make contact with any indigenous tribes? Thomas frowned. No. Why do you ask? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he asked another question. Did you know the people Crane was blackmailing? I did. I found his papers in his office. There was a list, initials and payments. Did you see the letter W? Thomas's face darkened. Yes, my father. Crane appears to have paid him £500, but in fact, the money was never paid. It was a fake receipt. Holmes nodded. This information matched the blackmail list he had found earlier. What Thomas said was consistent, but that didn't mean he was innocent. One last question, Thomas. That night, when you left Crane's room, how did you leave the door? Thomas thought. I left it open. I definitely didn't lock it from the inside. Crane was alive and sitting at his desk. Was he drinking wine? No. Actually, yes, there was a glass of wine on the desk, but it had just been opened. He hadn't drunk it yet. Holmes committed this information to memory. If Thomas was telling the truth, someone else must have put the poison in Crane's wine. After Thomas left. At that moment, the front door opened. Inspector Lestrade entered, followed by 2 police officers. Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade, his voice formal, Scotland Yard has officially opened an investigation into Sebastian Crane's death as a homicide, and we have an arrest warrant. Everyone held their breath. Lestrade turned to Thomas. Thomas Whitfield, I am arresting you as a suspect in the murder of Sebastian Crane. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. Thomas took a step back in shock. I didn't do it. I just explained I'm innocent. Holmes intervened. Inspector, this is premature. There isn't sufficient evidence yet. Lestrade shook his head. On the contrary, Holmes, there is plenty of evidence. Thomas Whitfield has the motive, the opportunity, and the past. And today we received new information. What information? Lestrade pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It has been discovered that during Thomas Whitfield's time in Brazil, he purchased rare herbal medicines from a local pharmacy. Among these medicines are plants containing curare-like substances. Holmes's eyes widened. Where did you get this information? An anonymous tip, but we verified it. The records exist. Thomas's face turned pale. This is a trap. I was just researching. But the police were already beside him. Handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. Thomas looked at Holmes one last time, his eyes filled with despair. Mr. Holmes, please, find the truth. I'm not a murderer. As Thomas was led away, Holmes watched from the window. Questions swirled in his mind. Thomas's story seemed sincere, but the Brazil connection was a serious clue. Curare poison was derived from South American plants, and Thomas had been there. But something bothered Holmes, the anonymous tip. Who would know about Thomas's purchases in Brazil? And why bring it up now? "Watson," said Holmes, turning, "this case is much more complicated than it appears. Someone is working to make Thomas look guilty." "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Holmes picked up his hat. "Come, we're going to the newspaper archives, and then we need to talk to a pharmacist. We need to learn everything about curare." Mrs. Crane called after them. "Mr. Holmes, do you think Thomas is really innocent?" Holmes paused at the door. "I'm not sure yet, Mrs. Crane, but I am sure of one thing. There are multiple secrets in this case, and I will uncover them all." When they stepped outside, the fog blanketing the streets of London had begun to thicken again. Gas lamps cast a faint glow. Somewhere a killer was still at large, and Holmes was determined to find him. Chapter 5. Hidden Footprints. The next morning, Holmes went to Scotland Yard early. He wanted to visit the cell where Thomas Whitfield was being held. Lestrade reluctantly gave permission, but assigned a guard to accompany them. The cell was cold and damp. Thomas sat on the wooden bunk in the corner, his head bowed. He raised his head when he saw Holmes. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. The skin under his eyes was bruised. His lips were chapped. "Mr. Holmes," said Thomas, his voice hoarse. "You came." Holmes stood in front of the bars. "I need to ask you a few more questions, Thomas. And this time, I want you to tell me the whole truth." Thomas nodded. "Ask. I have nothing left to hide." "What were you really doing in Brazil? Just researching Crane?" Thomas took a deep breath. He was silent for a moment, then began to speak. "I didn't tell you everything. Yes, I was looking for Crane's former partner, but I was doing something else too." "What?" "I was researching poison." Thomas's voice was a whisper. "There's a poison called curare. South American natives put it on their arrowheads. It paralyzes the muscles. The victim can't move but remains conscious for a while. Then respiratory failure and death." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You were researching this poison?" "Yes, I was thinking of killing Crane, I told you. I was looking for the perfect method. Curare seemed ideal because it would be difficult to detect in an autopsy. It would look like a heart attack." Watson stood behind Holmes and listened in astonishment. "So you really researched the poison?" "I did. I spoke to an indigenous healer who gave me information about curare, but—" Thomas paused. "I didn't buy the poison. I swear I just gathered information." "What about the pharmacy records?" asked Holmes. Lestrade said he bought rare herbal medicines from a local pharmacy. Thomas shook his head. "The things I bought weren't poison. They were herbal remedies related to my mother's illness. My mother died of lung disease, and I was afraid of catching the same disease. I had heard that there were plants in Brazil that were good for this disease." Holmes considered this information. What Thomas said made sense, but it was difficult to prove. "Can you give me a list of these herbal remedies?" "It should be in the pharmacy records. I didn't take anything like curare or anything like that." Holmes turned and signaled to the guard. The interview was over. But before leaving, Thomas called out, "Mr. Holmes, there's one more thing. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it was important." Holmes turned. "What?" "The night Crane died, there was someone else in the house, a visitor. He wanted to speak to Crane privately, so I left them alone." Holmes's heart quickened. "Who?" "Jonathan Pemberton." An hour later, Holmes and Watson were on their way to Pemberton's office. In the car, Watson asked, "Why didn't Thomas mention Pemberton was there earlier?" "Fear," said Holmes. "Or perhaps he genuinely didn't think it was important. Thomas went to his room after arguing with Crane. He may not have known when Pemberton came and went." When they arrived at Pemberton's office, the secretary stopped them. "Mr. Pemberton is ill today and isn't seeing visitors." Holmes pressed on resolutely. "We're here on behalf of Scotland Yard. This is a murder investigation." The secretary hesitated but backed down under Holmes's gaze. Inside they found Pemberton behind his desk. The man looked genuinely ill. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He was holding a glass of whiskey at this hour of the morning. "Holmes," said Pemberton, his voice weary. "You're here again?" "I learned you were at home the night Crane died, Pemberton. Why didn't you mention that?" Pemberton's hand trembled, the whiskey glass nearly falling. "Who said that?" "That doesn't matter. Were you there?" There was a long silence. Pemberton placed the glass on the table and bowed his head. "Yes, I was there." "Why?" "I wanted to talk to Crane. Business. I was going to offer him a partnership for a new play." Pemberton laughed bitterly. "Silly, isn't it? I wanted to partner with the man who had crushed me for years. But I had no choice. I was about to go bankrupt." "What did Crane say?" "He refused, smiling arrogantly." "Pemberton, you've always been second-rate and you'll stay that way," he said. Then he threw me out. Watson asked, "What time did you leave?" "Around 10 at night. Crane was alive and well. I didn't see anyone else after me." Holmes began pacing the room. He examined the papers on Pemberton's desk. "Was there any other issue between you and Crane? I saw the letter P on the blackmail list." Pemberton's face turned bright red. "That's old news. Years ago I made a stupid mistake. Crane found out and blackmailed me. I paid him. End of story." "What kind of mistake?" "It's irrelevant to this investigation, Holmes." "I decide what's relevant." Pemberton slammed his fist on the table. "I had an affair with a woman, a married woman. Crane got hold of photos and threatened me. If my wife found out, I'd lose everything. I paid and kept quiet." Holmes shook his head. This information gave Pemberton motivation. He had one more reason to hate Crane. "Pemberton, I'll ask you directly. Did you kill Crane?" Pemberton didn't look away. "No, I wanted to kill him so badly. I fantasized about it every day, but I didn't. I'm a coward, Holmes. I told you that before." Holmes studied Pemberton for a moment longer. The man was afraid, but was this fear from guilt or something else? "Thank you, Pemberton. Perhaps we'll meet again." In the afternoon, Holmes and Watson returned to Crane Manor. Holmes wanted to speak with the house staff, especially everyone who had been in the house on Crane's last night. Albert Finch greeted them and led them to the kitchen. There, 3 servants were waiting, an elderly cook, a middle-aged maid, and a young gardener. Holmes spoke to the cook first. The woman, named Martha, was 55 years old, round-faced and pleasant. "What time was dinner that night, Martha?" 7:30, sir, as usual. Master Crane dined alone. Mrs. Crane was out that night." "Did he drink wine with his meal?" "No, sir. Master Crane usually drank water with his meal. He drank his wine afterwards, in his study." "Who prepared the wine that night?" Martha thought. "I did, sir. As usual, I took a bottle from the cellar and placed it in the dining room. But the master took the bottle to his room himself." Holmes nodded and turned to the chambermaid. The woman, named Sarah, was in her 40s. and had harsh features. "Sarah, did you clean the rooms that night?" "Yes, sir. After dinner, as usual." "Did you go into Crane's study?" Sarah hesitated. "I did, sir, but only for a moment. The master was there, and when he saw me, he told me to leave." "What was he doing at the time?" "He was sitting at his desk. There were papers in front of him, and—" Sarah paused. "And?" "Thomas was there too, sir. They were talking. Not loudly, but there was a tense atmosphere." Holmes took notes. "What time was this?" "Around 9, sir." "When did Thomas leave the room?" "I don't know, sir. I left immediately." Holmes now asked the most important question. "Did anyone else enter Crane's room that night?" Sarah thought. Then her eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Late at night. I was about to go to bed around 11 o'clock. As I was passing through the corridor, I saw someone enter the study." Holmes's heart quickened. "Who?" "I couldn't see, sir. It was dark and I only saw a shadow, but—" "But—" Sarah's voice lowered. "There was a smell, sir. A strange, sharp smell. I'd never smelled it before." Holmes looked at Watson. They were both thinking the same thing. Curare. "Can you describe that smell, Sarah?" "It was bitter, sir, like almonds, but sharper. A medicinal smell." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. This was very important. Thomas had argued with Crane at 9 o'clock and left. Pemberton had arrived at 10. But at 11 o'clock that night, who had entered Crane's room? "Sarah, when you saw that shadow, can you say anything about its size? Was it tall or short?" Sarah thought. "Medium height, sir. Not very tall, not very short. But there was something else." "What?" "He was holding something in his hand. A small thing, maybe a bottle. I'm not sure, but that's what it looked like." Holmes was now almost certain. The murderer had entered Crane's room at 11 o'clock that night, poisoned his wine, and left. But who? "The gardener," said Holmes, turning to the young man. "Did you see anything outside the house that night?" The gardener, named James, was a shy-looking young man of 25. "I went to bed early that night, sir, but I noticed something in the morning." "What?" "There were footprints in the flower beds by the back door, sir. It had rained last night. The ground was wet. Someone had walked that way." Holmes jumped up immediately. "Show me." The gardener led them to the back of the house. The back door opened onto the kitchen. The flower beds beside it were still covered with damp soil, and Holmes noticed faint but visible footprints. He knelt down to examine them. "Watson, look at this. These prints are from a man's shoes. Medium size, probably 8 or 9. And look at the heel pattern." Watson bent down. "A flat heel. A cheap shoe." "Yes, a servant's shoe or a work boot." Holmes followed the tracks. They led to the end of the garden to a small door. "He entered and exited through here. He didn't use the front door." This was crucial. The killer had sneaked into the house, poisoned Crane, and left the same way. But how had he gotten in? And wasn't the door locked? Holmes examined the back door. The lock was intact, but Holmes noticed something. On the door frame, level with the lock, there were small scratches. "This door was forced, Watson. It was picked." "Professional work." "Yes, our killer is a skilled individual. He knows how to plan and leave no trace." Holmes stood up and fell deep in thought. But he made a mistake. He didn't account for the footprints. He didn't know it would rain that night. Watson asked, "Could Thomas be that professional?" Holmes shook his head. "I don't think so. Thomas is an angry, emotional young man. This murder is the work of a cold, calculating mind. It's someone else, Watson. Who? Holmes didn't answer because he didn't know yet, but he was getting closer. Every clue brought him a little closer to the truth. At that moment, something small fell from his pocket. As he bent down to pick it up, Watson asked, "What's that?" Holmes showed him the object in his hand. It was a small, dried ink stain. He had found it in Thomas's room and overlooked it. "Ink, Watson, but not ordinary ink. Look at the colour. Dark purple, almost black. It's a special formula." Holmes brought the ink stain close to his nose and sniffed it. "Iron and acorn-based. Old-fashioned ink. Very few people use it now." "What's the significance of that?" Holmes smiled. "I saw the same ink used in Vincent Whitfield's play draft, Watson. It was used in his VW signature. This ink could be a family tradition." "So Thomas is using his father's ink?" "It seems so, but the real question is—" Holmes put the ink stain in his pocket. "Where did this ink come from? Perhaps the answer will lead us to the killer." When evening came, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson brought them tea, but Holmes didn't drink it. He sat in front of the fireplace, lost in thought. "Watson," he said finally, "there are too many suspects in this case. Thomas, Pemberton, Dorothy, even Mrs. Crane. They all have a motive, but there can only be one murderer." "Who do you suspect?" Holmes put his finger to his lips. "I'm not sure yet, but I know a few things. The killer is someone who knew Crane, someone knowledgeable enough to sneak into the house, someone with access to a source of curare poison, and a cold-blooded planner. Doesn't Thomas fit that profile? Partially, but Thomas's story was sincere, and the anonymous tip bothers me. Someone is trying to frame Thomas." Watson thought. Could it be the real killer, to make Thomas the scapegoat? Probably. Holmes stood up. "Tomorrow I need to talk to a few more people, and I'll go back to the newspaper archives. There are still missing pieces in Vincent Whitfield's story." That night, Holmes didn't sleep again. The wheels in his mind were turning incessantly. Somewhere there was something he hadn't seen, a connection, a clue, and he would find it. Outside, the stars were shining over London, but in the city streets dark secrets still lurked, and a killer roamed free. Chapter 6: Blood and Ink. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of Baker Street, Holmes was already up. He hadn't slept all night, but instead of fatigue, his eyes were filled with excitement. He was onto something, and it was getting closer. When Watson came downstairs, he found Holmes at the door. "Where are you going so early?" "To the newspaper archives at the British Museum, Watson. There are still things we don't know about Vincent Whitfield, and today I will find them." Watson quickly ate breakfast and joined Holmes. In the car, Holmes was silent. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his knee, a sign that he was deep in thought. When they arrived at the British Museum, Holmes headed straight for the archives. An elderly archivist greeted them and brought Holmes the newspapers from the years he requested. The Times, Morning Chronicle, and Daily Telegraph collections from 1880, 1881, and 1882. Holmes began working systematically. He scanned each page carefully, looking for the name Vincent Whitfield. Watson was helping, but it was hard to keep up with Holmes's pace. The first significant discovery was a news item from 1880. A small article titled "Young Playwright Signs Major Success" stated that Vincent Whitfield had finished his play Dance of the Shadows and was looking for a producer to stage it. "Look, Watson," said Holmes, "Vincent finished his play in 1880, and here—" He turned to another newspaper. Later that same year, Sebastian Crane was announced as the producer of Dance of the Shadows. But Vincent's name is nowhere to be found. Watson frowned. Crane erased Vincent's name completely, and look here. Holmes pointed to a newspaper from 1881. The play is a huge success. Critics are praising Crane to the skies. "A new genius is born," they write. But the real genius was Vincent Whitfield, whose name isn't even mentioned. Holmes continued his search. When he reached 1882, he found what he was looking for. Here it is, Watson. The obituary of Vincent Whitfield. The news was a small paragraph squeezed into a corner. Vincent Whitfield, 32, was found drowned in the Thames last night. Whitfield is believed to have committed suicide. He is survived by his wife Catherine and his 6-year-old son. Watson shook his head. A 6-year-old son. Thomas. Yes, but look, Watson. Holmes pointed to the rest of the article. The son's name isn't mentioned here. It just says 6-year-old son. But elsewhere... Holmes turned to another newspaper. This one was smaller, a local paper. The Greenwich Chronicle, same date, Vincent Whitfield's obituary. This article had more details. Vincent Whitfield's funeral was held at Greenwich Cemetery with a small number of attendees. His wife, Catherine Murray Whitfield, and his son, Thomas Vincent Whitfield, were present at the funeral. The Whitfield family is not accepting condolence visits. Holmes placed his finger on the name. Thomas Vincent Whitfield. That's his full name. He bears his father's name. Watson asked, "How is that relevant?" "Perhaps not at all, perhaps everything." Holmes folded the newspaper thoughtfully. "But, more importantly, Watson, this article mentions Catherine's maiden name, Murray. And look, there's another detail." Holmes opened another page of the newspaper. There was a small announcement. Catherine Murray Whitfield and her son Thomas are moving to Edinburgh to live with the Murray family. All debts in London will be paid by the Murray family. "Edinburgh," said Watson. "Thomas is from there." "Yes, and now we know something else." Holmes stood up. "The Murray family is wealthy enough to pay Vincent's debts. But why didn't they help Vincent while he was alive?" This question echoed in Holmes' mind. Catherine's family was wealthy, but Vincent had died in financial distress. Why? When they left the British Museum, it was past noon. Holmes thought for a moment, then turned to Watson. "We're going to Scotland Yard. I need to talk to Thomas again." Half an hour later, they were back in front of that cold cell. Thomas looked worse than the day before. His eyes were sunken. His hands were shaking. "Mr. Holmes," Thomas said, his voice low. "Did you find anything?" "A few more questions, Thomas." Holmes approached the bars. "What do you know about your mother's family, the Murrays?" A pained expression crossed Thomas's face. "A lot, and nothing." "Explain." Thomas took a deep breath. "My mother's family were one of Edinburgh's most established families. Wealthy, influential. But when my father married Vincent, they disowned her." "Why?" "My father was a poor playwright, an artist, a dreamer. Unacceptable to the Murrays. My mother married him anyway, and her family disinherited her." Watson interjected. "But after Vincent died, they accepted you." "Yes." Thomas's voice hardened. "When my father died, my mother was no longer that man's wife. The Murrays took her and me back to Edinburgh. But we paid the price. What price? Shame, silence. Mentioning my father's name was forbidden in that house. Growing up, I didn't even know who my father was. Not until my mother fell ill. Holmes digested this information. When did your mother tell you the truth? I was 11. My mother was on her deathbed. In her final days, she told me everything. My father's story, what Crane did, his suicide. And she asked me for something. What? Thomas's eyes filled with tears. To clear my father's name, to make the truth known. But she also warned me not to seek revenge. Seek justice, but not revenge, he said. Holmes shook his head. Then why did you join Crane? Wasn't that revenge? It was at first, but it changed over time. As I got to know Crane, I realized he was also a victim of his own conscience. He had nightmares every night. He couldn't sleep without sleeping pills. Thomas paused. One night, I saw him crying in his office. He was looking at my father's photo. That's when I realized Crane was already living in hell. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he moved on to another subject. Thomas, let's talk about the items we found in his room. There was a wooden box containing your father's photograph and letter. What else was in that box? Thomas thought. A few small items. My father's pen set, a bottle of ink, my mother's hair clip. Ink? Holmes's eyes lit up. What kind of ink? It was my father's special formula. He made it himself based on iron and oak gall. It was a deep purple, almost black. I used the same ink in memory of my father. Holmes took the small ink stain out of his pocket. Is this it? Thomas looked at it and nodded. Yes, that's it. Where did you find it? In his room. Holmes put the ink back in his pocket. Thomas, this ink is very special. Very few people know a formula like this. Do you know where your father learned this formula? I don't know. Maybe his family taught him. I know very little about my father's family. Holmes was deep in thought. This ink was a clue, but where it would lead was still unclear. One last question, Thomas. Was there anyone else in Crane's house who could have used this ink besides you? Thomas was surprised. No, I don't think so. Why do you ask? Holmes did not answer, but a new thought had formed in his mind. If Thomas was the only user of the ink, then certain documents must have been written by him. But what if someone else had also used this ink? When they left Scotland Yard, Holmes made a decision. Watson, we're going back to Crane Manor. I need to search Thomas's room again. What are you looking for? I don't know yet, but something must have escaped my notice. An hour later, they were back in Thomas's small attic room. Holmes examined every corner, every crack. He looked under the bed, probed the floorboards, listened to the walls. Finally, he found something. In the corner of the room, there was a small crack in the baseboard between the wall and the floor. Holmes took out his knife and widened the crack. A small cavity appeared behind it. A secret compartment, said Holmes, reaching inside. Something touched his fingers. Paper. When he pulled it out, he was holding an old, folded letter. He opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was written in Vincent Whitfield's handwriting. But this was different from the letter they had found before. This was the last letter written to Catherine. Dear Catherine, by the time you read this letter, I will no longer be with you. I didn't want to do this, but I can't find another way. Crane took everything from me, my game, my reputation, my future. And now he's even blocking your family's help. Yes, I know. The Murrays wanted to help us. But Crane threatened your father. If they helped us, he would expose his dark secrets. Your family is a victim too, Catherine. We are all Crane's victims. Protect Thomas, keep him away from this monster, and one day, when the time is right, tell him everything. He must know the truth. But he must not seek revenge. Revenge would make us like Crane. I will love you and Thomas forever. Vincent. Holmes read the letter carefully. This was new information. Crane had threatened not only Vincent, but the Murray family as well. The blackmail chain was wider than he had thought. Watson, said Holmes, showing him the letter. Crane knew a secret about the Murray family too. He used it to silence them. Watson read the letter. This is terrible, Holmes. Crane really is a monster. Yes, and now the question is, what was the Murray family's secret? And could this secret be connected to the murder? Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold. The pieces were slowly coming together in his mind. Watson, we may need to go to Edinburgh tomorrow. We need to talk to the Murray family. Edinburgh? That's a long journey. Yes, but it's necessary. Holmes turned. There's still a dimension to this case we haven't seen. What Thomas said may be true. Perhaps the real killer is someone we never thought of. That night on Baker Street, Holmes sat in front of the fireplace, deep in thought. In front of him was a piece of paper on which he had written all the clues. The second fingerprint on the wine glass, thin, long fingers, Crane's diary note. Is VW's son still alive? The play draft signed VW. Special purple ink, Thomas's trip to Brazil. Knowledge of Carrare. The blackmail list. W. P. M. D. Special ink, Thomas's family formula. The shadow Sarah saw, 11 p.m., bottle in hand. Vincent's last letter. Threat to the Murray family footprints at the back door. Size 8 to 9. Flat heel. Holmes looked at the list. 9 clues, all pointing to one place. But where? Thomas has the motive, he thought aloud. But it doesn't fit his character profile. He's too emotional, too open. This murder is the work of cold-blooded planning. Watson was sitting in the opposite armchair. Pemberton? A coward, his own confession. And he left at 10 o'clock that night. Sarah saw the shadow at 11. Dorothy Mills? She has the motive, but not the opportunity. She stayed home that night. She has witnesses. Mrs. Crane? Holmes paused. An interesting possibility. Sole heir to her husband's fortune. And she said she was out that night. But where was she? Watson thought. We never asked. No, we didn't. Holmes stood up. Tomorrow we'll speak with Mrs. Crane first, then Edinburgh. But just then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hudson announced a late-night visitor. Who? Holmes asked. Mr. Albert Finch, sir, the butler at Crane Manor. He looks very agitated. Holmes and Watson looked at each other. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. When Finch entered the room, his face was ashen. His hands were shaking, his breath was ragged. Mr. Holmes, said Finch, his voice barely audible. Something terrible has happened. Mrs. Crane. Mrs. Crane has disappeared. Chapter 7. The Daughter's Revenge. Holmes jumped to his feet at Finch's words. That familiar sharpness in his eyes, the gleam of a hunter who has spotted his prey, had appeared. When did he disappear? Holmes asked, his voice harsh and urgent. Finch was trembling. The fear on the old man's face was real. This evening, sir. After dinner she retired to her room. An hour later, when I brought her tea, her room was empty. The window was open and Mrs. Crane was nowhere to be found. Watson asked anxiously, Could she have been kidnapped? I don't know, sir, but there's something else. Finch took a folded piece of paper from his pocket. We found this on her bed. Holmes took the paper and unfolded it. Written in neat feminine handwriting were the words, "I know everything. I learned the truth. I can't stay in this house anymore. Don't look for me." Holmes examined the letter carefully. He held the paper up to the light, looked at the colour of the ink, paid attention to the slant of the writing. Then he brought it close to his nose and sniffed. "Mrs. Crane did not write this letter," Holmes said firmly. Finch looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean, sir?" "The ink, Watson. Look, it's dark purple, almost black. That's our special ink, Thomas's family formula." Holmes placed the paper on the table. "Mrs. Crane uses standard black ink. Someone else wrote this letter and tried to imitate Mrs. Crane's handwriting." Watson's eyes widened. "So Mrs. Crane has been kidnapped?" "Or worse." Holmes picked up his hat and coat. "Finch, we're returning to Crane Manor immediately, and on the way, send word to Scotland Yard. Tell Lestrade it's urgent." By the time they reached Crane Manor, it was close to midnight. The house was dark and silent. Only a few windows were lit. Holmes scanned the house carefully before getting out of the carriage. "Watson," he said quietly, "go to the back door and wait there. Don't let anyone escape." Watson nodded and disappeared into the darkness. Holmes and Finch entered through the front door. Holmes was silent. He slowly waved his lantern, illuminating the surroundings. The stairs, the paintings, the rugs. Everything was in its place. But something was different. There was a faint smell in the air. Holmes stopped and sniffed. "This smell familiar?" Finch asked. "What smell, sir?" "Bitter almonds. Very faint, but it's there." Holmes's face grew serious. "The same smell I got the night Crane died." Holmes quickly climbed the stairs. He headed for Mrs. Crane's room. The door was open, the room dark. When Holmes shone his lantern inside, he saw a room in disarray. Drawers were open, clothes were strewn on the floor. "Someone was looking for something," Holmes said, "and they were in a hurry." He walked to the window. It was open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. Outside, one floor down, was the garden. Holmes bent down to look. Indeed, the moonlight, footprints were visible in the flower beds. The same footprints Watson found. Size 8 or 9, flat soles. Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. "Our killer has returned." At that moment, a sound came from below. A door slammed, then the sound of running feet. Holmes quickly left the room and ran to the stairs. Downstairs, in front of the back door, Watson was wrestling with someone. The figures were indistinguishable in the darkness. Holmes leaped down the stairs 3 at a time and plunged into the fight. A fist whistled through the air. Holmes ducked and counterattacked. The figure he grabbed by the wrists resisted with unexpected strength. But Holmes's boxing training from university paid off. Within seconds, he knocked the figure to the ground and pinned his arms behind him. "Watson, turn on the light." Watson, breathless, lit the gas lamp on the wall. When the yellow light illuminated the room, Holmes saw the face of the figure lying on the floor, Dorothy Mills. The young actress's face was contorted with rage. Her eyes glowed with a wild light. Her lip was split, and there was a scratch on her cheek. "Let me go!" Dorothy shouted. "This is none of your business." Holmes did not let her go. "Dorothy Mills, or by your real name. Tell me who you are." A moment of surprise flashed across Dorothy's face. Then that wild expression returned. "What do you mean?" Holmes stood up, but didn't let go of Dorothy's arms. Watson came over and held the young woman's other arm. She couldn't escape now. "Something has bothered me from the beginning," said Holmes, his voice calm but firm. Thomas Whitfield was Vincent's son. But did Vincent have only one child? Dorothy's face paled. "While researching newspaper archives, I found something interesting. Vincent Whitfield married Catherine Murray in 1875. But before he married her, he had a relationship with another woman. In 1870, when he was only 20 years old, he was involved with a young actress. That actress's name was Martha Mills." Watson looked stunned. "Mills?" "Yes, Dorothy's mother." Holmes looked into Dorothy's eyes. Martha Mills gave birth to a daughter in 1871. The father's name wasn't recorded, but the child was registered as Dorothy Victoria Mills. Dorothy was trembling. Tears began to flow from her eyes, but her anger had not subsided. "Victoria," Holmes said slowly. "The letter V. And look, more interesting. Vincent's full name was Vincent William Whitfield. His middle name was William. VW. But he also named his little girl Victoria. The letter V was their shared symbol." Dorothy's resistance broke. Her shoulders slumped. Her head bowed. "How do you know?" she whispered. "The ink told me." Holmes pulled the small purple ink stain from his pocket. "This special formula was the Whitfield family's secret. Thomas uses it, inherited from his father. But you use it too, Dorothy, because you are Vincent's child." Silence. Then Dorothy began to speak. Her voice was broken, weary, carrying the weight of the years. "My mother loved Vincent madly, but Vincent abandoned her. He married Catherine Murray, a rich, noble, suitable woman. He left her while she was pregnant." Holmes nodded. "Go on." "My mother raised me alone. We were poor, we were miserable. She worked as an extra in theatres, sometimes worse jobs. Growing up, I didn't even know who my father was. My mother wouldn't tell me." "When did you find out?" "When I was 15. My mother got sick. She was dying. In her last days, she told me everything. My father's name, his story, how Crane ruined him." Dorothy's voice hardened. "My mother still loved Vincent. She didn't even resent him for leaving her. She just hated Crane. That monster killed Vincent," she said. "One day, someone has to stop him," Watson asked. "And you decided to be that someone?" "Not right away." Dorothy lifted her head, her eyes red, but no longer crying. "I spent years planning. I became an actress. I was talented. I managed to catch Crane's attention. He discovered me, gave me big roles. Poor man, he didn't know he was inviting his killer into his home." Holmes interrupted. "When did you discover Thomas?" "About 6 months ago. Crane's young assistant, who worked for him, acted strangely one day. I investigated and learned the truth. Thomas was my stepbrother. We were both Vincent's children. We both wanted revenge on Crane." "Did Thomas know this?" Dorothy shook her head. "No, I never told him. He only knew he was his father's son. He didn't know I existed." Holmes began to pace thoughtfully. The pieces were now falling into place. "That night, the night Crane died, what happened?" Dorothy took a deep breath. "The plan was ready. I had obtained curare from Brazil. When Thomas went there, I followed him. I was there while he spoke with the native healer. But he didn't see me." "You took the poison?" "Yes. Thomas only gathered information. He chickened out. I took action." A strange pride flashed in Dorothy's eyes. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I entered through the back door. Unlocking it was easy. My mother had taught me many things. I went up to Crane's study. The man was sitting at his desk, getting ready to drink his wine. "Did he see you?" "No. I waited in the shadows. I had put the poison in his wine earlier that afternoon. In the bottle in the kitchen. Crane drank the same wine every evening. He was a creature of habit." Watson asked in horror, "You put the poison in beforehand. What if someone else had drunk it?" "They wouldn't have. That wine was from Crane's special collection. No one touched it." Dorothy shrugged. "I had everything figured out." Holmes was trying to clarify something in his mind. "Then why did you go into the room at 11 o'clock? The poison was already in the wine." A dark smile appeared on Dorothy's face. "To watch. I wanted to see him die. I wanted to watch the man who ruined my father take his last breath." An eerie silence fell over the room. Dorothy's cold-bloodedness, her calculated cruelty, had even surprised Holmes. "And did you see it?" Holmes asked in a low voice. "I saw it." Dorothy's eyes gazed into the distance, as if reliving that moment. He took a sip of his wine. Nothing happened for a few minutes. Then his hand began to tremble. The glass slipped from his hand and rolled onto the floor. He tried to breathe, but his muscles wouldn't work. His eyes were open. He saw me. Yes, he saw me in his last moment. I don't know if he recognized me, but I saw the fear in his eyes. That fear was worth years of pain. Watson recoiled in disgust. That's monstrous." "Monstrous?" Dorothy's voice rose. "Crane ruined people for years. He drove my father to suicide, condemned my mother to misery, destroyed Thomas's family. He crushed dozens of people with blackmail. I just served justice." Holmes asked coldly. "And Mrs. Crane? Will she also be a victim of your justice?" Dorothy's face changed. For the first time, she showed hesitation. "She is different. Where is Mrs. Crane?" Silence. "Dorothy, where is that woman?" Dorothy turned her head and looked at the wall. "The basement, in the old wine cellar. I haven't killed her yet." Holmes moved quickly. "Watson, hold her. Don't let her go until Lestrade arrives. I'll find Mrs. Crane." The cellar was cold and dark. Holmes descended the stairs with his lantern. The stone walls glistened with dampness, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and old wine. "Mrs. Crane," Holmes called out. "Where are you?" A muffled voice came from afar. Holmes ran toward the sound. In the far corner of the wine cellar, behind some old barrels, Harriet Crane lay. Her hands were tied behind her back. A cloth gagged her mouth. Holmes quickly untied the cloth. Harriet coughed, trying to breathe. "Mr. Holmes," said the woman, her voice hoarse. "Dorothy, that crazy girl. She confessed everything. She killed my husband." "I know, Mrs. Crane. You're safe now." Holmes helped the woman to her feet and began to lead her upstairs. Harriet was shivering, both from the cold and from fear. "Why?" Harriet asked on the way. "Why did she want to kill me too?" "Because you knew too, Mrs. Crane. Your husband's dark past, his blackmail, everything he did. Dorothy didn't want any witnesses." Harriet's face paled. I didn't do anything. I just kept quiet." "Sometimes silence is complicity, Mrs. Crane." Holmes's voice was soft, but his words were firm. "But tonight, your life was saved. That's something." Half an hour later, Crane Manor was filled with police and detectives. As Lestrade handcuffed Dorothy Mills and led her away, the young woman turned to Holmes one last time. Mr. Holmes, Dorothy said, her voice surprisingly calm. I have a question. Holmes waited. How did you catch me? What mistake did I make? Holmes thought for a moment. The ink, your special formula, the Whitfield family legacy. You used it in the fake letter you left on Mrs. Crane's bed. The moment I saw that ink, the pieces fell into place. Dorothy laughed bitterly. My father's legacy. It betrayed me in the end. No, Dorothy. Holmes shook his head. It was your anger that betrayed you. Your impatience. If you hadn't attacked Mrs. Crane, you might have gotten away. You could have made Thomas the scapegoat and walked away without looking back. But you wanted more. Yes, said Dorothy, her eyes shining. I wanted more. I wanted Crane's whole world to collapse. His wife, his reputation, everything. I wanted him to suffer, even after death. Lestrade pulled her away. Dorothy didn't look back as she left. As the first light of dawn fell, over London, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street. Both were tired, but there was a strange sadness in Holmes's eyes. Watson sat down in front of the fireplace. It was a strange case, Holmes. We caught the right person in the end, but it doesn't feel like a victory, does it? Holmes walked to the window and looked out. The streets were slowly waking up. Vendors were setting up their stalls. Workers were heading to their factories. A normal London morning. Vincent Whitfield, Holmes said thoughtfully. A man who died 15 years ago is still ruining lives. His son Thomas was wrongfully imprisoned. His daughter Dorothy became a murderer seeking revenge, and neither of them knew each other. Watson nodded. Crane poisoned many people's lives. Yes, but the real tragedy is this, Watson. Holmes turned, his face serious. Dorothy was right about one thing. Crane was a monster, blackmail, theft, threats. He crushed people for years and never faced justice. The law couldn't stop him. In the end, justice was served, albeit in the wrong way, by someone else. Justice, you say? This is murder, Holmes. I know, Watson, and Dorothy will pay for it. But think, if Crane had lived, how many more people would he have ruined? How many more Vincent Whitfields? Holmes sighed. Sometimes I wonder, is the legal system truly fair? The rich and powerful always escape, while the poor and weak are crushed. Watson was uncomfortable. Do you think Dorothy was right? No. Holmes shook his head firmly. Murder is never the solution. But I understand Dorothy's pain. I understand her anger. And that troubles me. There was silence for a moment. Then Watson asked, What about Thomas? He'll be released. Dorothy confessed everything. Thomas's innocence has been proven. Holmes sat down in his chair. But life won't be the same for that young man. He'll learn about his father's story, his sister's existence, everything. How will he live with that knowledge? Maybe he'll make a new start. Maybe. Holmes lit his pipe, smoke rising slowly. Or maybe he'll follow in his father's footsteps. The poison of revenge is strong, Watson. It destroyed Dorothy. It could destroy Thomas too. Watson asked gloomily, Is there no happy ending to this story? Holmes smiled, but it was a sad smile. In real life, there are rarely happy endings, Watson. Only endings, and then new beginnings. That afternoon they had an unexpected visitor. Thomas Whitfield had been released from Scotland Yard and had come straight to Baker Street. Holmes let him in. The young man was still pale, the circles under his eyes hadn't faded. But there was a change in his demeanour. He seemed calmer, more mature. Mr. Holmes, Thomas said, sitting down, I came to thank you. You saved me. I only found the truth, Thomas. No one deserves thanks. Thomas bowed his head. I heard about Dorothy, that she was my sister. I never knew. I know. I want to see her, in prison. I want to talk to her. Holmes was surprised. Why? She tried to frame you. She could have ruined your life. Thomas looked thoughtfully out the window. Because she's a victim too, like me. We're both victims of Crane's story, of our father's story. Maybe we can understand each other. Holmes studied the young man for a moment. He saw a maturity, a wisdom in Thomas. The pain of the years hadn't hardened him. It had deepened him. What will you do now, Thomas? I don't know. Thomas shrugged. I can't stay in London anymore. There are too many memories, too much pain here. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll write. My father was a playwright. Maybe I can write too. So you want to carry on your father's legacy? Yes, but not his mistakes, his talents. Thomas stood up. Mr. Holmes, I want to ask one more thing. Ask. Dorothy, will she be executed? Holmes decided to be honest. Probably yes. Murder, premeditated. The jury may show no mercy. Thomas's face contorted with pain. I just found her and now I'm going to lose her. Life is sometimes unfair, Thomas. You know that better than anyone. Thomas nodded. He walked to the door and paused on the threshold. Mr. Holmes, one last question. My father, do you think he was a good man? Holmes thought. Vincent Whitfield was a talented writer. He was a man who loved his family, but he was also weak. He broke your mother's heart. He abandoned Dorothy's mother. He wasn't perfect, Thomas. But who is? Thomas smiled. For the first time, a genuine smile appeared on his face. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for your honesty. And the young man left. That night, Holmes sat in front of the fireplace, watching the flames dance. Watson was beside him, sipping a glass of brandy. Tomorrow the newspapers will be full of this case, said Watson. A huge scandal. Famous theatre producer murdered by an illegitimate child. Yes, and Vincent Whitfield's story will finally come to light. Perhaps his name will be cleared. Holmes puffed on his pipe, thinking, that's a kind of justice. Not for Dorothy. No, not for Dorothy, Holmes sighed. But perhaps for Thomas. His father's name being cleared might bring him some peace. Watson raised his glass. To this case, solved, but with unresolved elements still within. Holmes raised his glass. Always so, Watson. Every murder is like an iceberg. We only see the surface. Beneath it lie years of accumulated pain, anger, betrayal. We only solve the surface, the depths. We can never fully understand the depths. The glasses clinked. Outside, the London night had fallen. The stars shone dimly behind the city's smoke and fog. Watson set his glass down on the table and gazed into the fire. Holmes, I want to ask you something. We've been working together for so many years, but there's still something I wonder about. Holmes raised his eyebrows. Ask, Watson. Why do you do this? Not for money, I know that. Not for fame either. Then why? Why do you throw yourself into these dark stories, working day and night, not sleeping, not eating? Holmes was silent for a moment. He took a deep drag on his pipe, the smoke curling up towards the ceiling. Then he began to speak, his voice softer than usual. Because, Watson, justice doesn't come on its own in this world. Someone has to seek it, find it, bring it to light. There are people like Vincent Whitfield, talented, innocent, looking at life with hope. And there are people like Sebastian Crane, ruthless, greedy, who disregard the lives of others. If there weren't people like us, the Cranes would win. They always win. Watson nodded thoughtfully, but even this time, justice hasn't been fully served. Dorothy will be executed, Thomas must rebuild his life. Vincent's name will only be cleared 15 years after his death. True. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street lamps flickered in the fog. A night watchman passed, blowing his whistle, his footsteps slowly fading away. Justice isn't perfect, Watson. It never will be, but it's better than nothing. Vincent's story will now be known. People will learn Crane's true face. And perhaps, just perhaps, another young writer will think twice before becoming the victim of another greedy producer. Watson rose from his chair and joined his friend. Side by side, they gazed out at the nightscape of London. Thousands of chimneys smoked, thousands of windows flickered with light. Behind every light was a life, a story, perhaps a secret. Right now, Holmes said slowly, how many people in this city do you think are suffering, Watson? How many have been wronged? How many are waiting for help to escape the clutches of criminals? Watson shrugged. Too many to count. That's why I do it. Every case can change someone's life. Thomas is free today. Mrs. Crane is alive. And Vincent Whitfield's spirit can rest a little easier now. They stood silently for a moment. Then Watson sighed and returned to his chair. I'm tired, Holmes. I need to sleep tonight. You should sleep too. Holmes smiled, but didn't take his eyes off the window. I'll stay a little longer, Watson. I have things to think about. Watson stood in the doorway. What will we do tomorrow? I don't know. Maybe a new case will come. Maybe it won't. But one thing is certain, Watson. Holmes turned, that familiar determination shining in his eyes once more. Whatever happens, we'll be ready. Watson smiled and climbed the stairs. When his footsteps faded upstairs, Holmes turned back to the window. Outside, the fog was thickening. London was keeping its secrets. But Holmes knew those secrets couldn't remain hidden forever. One day, somehow, they would all come to light. Somewhere, Thomas. Whitfield was thinking about tomorrow. In a prison cell, Dorothy Mills was preparing for her fate. And on Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes was waiting for a new case. The fire in the fireplace was slowly dying down. Holmes looked at the flames one last time, then put out his pipe and sat down at his desk. In front of him was a blank notebook, its first page pure white. He picked up his pen and began to write. The Crane case, final notes. Because crime never ended in London, and Holmes was ready to solve it. Always. And outside, in the heart of the city, a new day was about to dawn. As the first light of morning filtered through the windows of Baker Street, Holmes was still sitting at his desk. He had finished the final notes on the Crane case. The ink was still wet. Outside, London was waking up. Horse-drawn carriages were beginning to fill the streets, and the voices of newspaper vendors were rising. Watson came down the stairs, heading downstairs for breakfast as usual. Didn't you sleep, Holmes? Before Holmes could answer, the doorbell rang. Sharp, urgent, unusual for this early hour of the morning. When Mrs. Hudson opened the door, a young man burst in. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. His hands were trembling, his expensive clothes drenched in sweat. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "for God's sake, help me! Something terrible has happened." Holmes stood up, that familiar sharpness appearing instantly in his eyes. "Calm down. What is your name?" "Edward Blackwood, sir. Heir to the Blackwood estate." The young man slumped into a chair, his hands over his face. Tonight my father was murdered. But Mr. Holmes, whoever killed him couldn't have been human. Watson frowned. What do you mean? Edward Blackwood raised his head. His eyes held pure terror, the look of someone who had witnessed something unimaginable. My father gets up early in the morning and goes to his study without breakfast. I went up to his room to bring him breakfast, but I found him dead at his desk. But the most terrifying thing, the young man trembled. There was a mark on my father's chest, a burn mark in the shape of a hand, as if a hand from hell had grabbed him and stopped his heart. Holmes and Watson looked at each other. "And there's something else," said Edward, his voice dropping to a whisper. There was a message written in blood on the wall. "The Blackwood curse has begun. All will die within 7 days. Mr. Holmes, there are 7 people in my family, and tonight the first one died." Holmes walked to the window. Outside, the sun was rising, but inside, a new darkness had fallen. "Watson," said Holmes, his voice calm but determined, "forget breakfast. It seems we have a new case." And as he picked up his hat, he added, "What's more, this time, we don't even know if our enemy is human or not." Outside, dark clouds were gathering over London. It was as if the city sensed the approaching storm. The Blackwood curse had begun, and the subject of the next video was thus decided. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear about the Blackwood curse, please share your thoughts with me in the comments. Good night for now.